so much, Dr. Stinson. I think we all feel an awful lot better about going for the It Feels Okay. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. I am now going to hand over to Dr. Rice. Yeah, Dr. Rice. Shall I help you do those? Yeah. I'm going to eat the chocolate. Dr. Rice.
Am I allowed to give out some chocolate?
FaceTime one from Eva.
I will indeed. Okay, so brilliant. Well, good evening, everyone. And may I begin by saying a massive thank you to Catherine, our head of sixth form, for inviting me to speak at our inaugural Ambition lecture series. I must say, after reading some of the other titles from my wonderful colleagues and chocolate, beaches, sangria, I started to get a little bit worried. How on earth am I going to get, make sure that I get the attention and keep my audience engaged? And I started to think about the last 6 years now that I've been living in Suffolk, living in this lovely area, and trying to think about what really have I found, or who do the people usually love when you mention, yeah, from Ireland, and I thought straight away of the late great Terry Wogan. So if all else fails, at least you remember that I was very fortunate to have been interviewed by the late great Terry back in 2010. To my students, that was not my fashion. That was my accordion band outfit, long story. But hopefully, yeah, I've got your attention. And also, I hope this is not the only thing that you remember from my lecture this evening. So, shaping peace amongst hawks and doves. In order to explain this properly, I'd like to delve back straight actually to Friday the 10th, 1998. That is in fact 9,512 days ago, or 26 years ago from this very evening. And you might think, why on earth is she talking about that? Now I can also tell you that I was eating fish and chips on that particular evening. How do I know? It was Good Friday. I suspect, Catherine, you were eating fish and chips as well. It was Good Friday, and so it was a treat. My parents were treating me and my three brothers to fish and chips, so it was really lovely evening. But I also remember it because, for a more vivid reason actually, as my mum went in to get the fish and chips, she left me and my brother Sean in the car, and I remember it was crazy outside really. There was people blowing horns and flying flags and crying. And I remember saying, why is that woman crying? But she looks really happy. And my brother, being 3 years older than me, said, you Egypt. I probably said something a bit more rude, but Briege, you Egypt. How can you not know? There's peace. It's the Good Friday Agreement. The politicians have signed the Good Friday Agreement. Now, another fact that I'd like to point out at the start of this 20-minute lecture, so stick with me for the 20 minutes, is that I myself am very fortunate. I never personally experienced the Troubles. And I'm conscious, obviously, that there are many people in this room that may have personal experiences from the Troubles. I was lucky that I was never physically hurt by the violence that engulfed Northern Ireland. And apart from one vivid memory really at primary school when there was a helicopter in the sky and I genuinely thought it was a spaceship or Star Wars or something, I had a very normal, and thankfully a very safe childhood. But at 11 years of age, and that evening, watching the news with my parents, they kept saying, for nearly 30 years, the Troubles, nearly 30 years. And I said to my dad, why did they keep talking about 30 years, Daddy? Why on earth did it take them so long to find peace? And 12 years after that, in 2010, I started my PhD, and that was really the question that I was trying to answer. Why was it taking 30 years for these people, particularly the British and Irish states, to achieve the peace process that thankfully we have today? Now, I'd like you to look at the screen and raise your hand if you know or recognise any of the people on that particular slide. I thought so, yeah, absolutely. So these are, of course, the famous policy makers, and rightfully so for the wonderful roles that they had during the peace process, particularly from the 1980s onwards. And I will discuss these important figures later on. But I want to begin in the area that really I researched, and that was the 1968 to 1971 period, to give you an insight into what policy makers were doing then, and quite frankly assess why again it took 30 years for them to reach an agreement. If I may, I'll give you a brief summary as well of my methodology. For 3.5 years, I travelled the length and breadth of Ireland and England really. I travelled to the archives in Dublin, Belfast, Galway, Derry, the Imperial War Museum in London, and I went to the National Archives in London every 3 weeks, filming and taking pictures of files. I'd say about 600 to 700 pictures a day. There were no iPhones, folks. Don't look at my students. So that's in the top left is Mr. Kodak. That became my best friend, that camera. And taking pictures that I can then analyse the documents when I got back home to Belfast at the time. And another important decision that I made at the very beginning of this project was quite controversial to some of my colleagues and peers at Queen's University Belfast, and that was that I made the conscious decision that I would not include any interviews in my PhD, in my research. Some people thought I was crazy. What? Are you mad? You've met a lot of the key actors. It would be much easier than having to traipse through all of those files. But really, I was very conscious, and even researching and preparing for this, reminded that it is such an emotive issue. It's such an emotive topic, really. And dare I say, memories can be skewed. Take the 5th of October 1968, for example, the Civil Rights March. There were approximately 600 people at this particular Civil Rights March, which is viewed by many historians as the birth of the Troubles. And yet so many people were interviewed after that particular march that really it would probably add up to about 6,000 people who said that they were at that particular march. Now this is because unlike previous wars and previous battles and previous outbreaks of violence, the Troubles were obviously filmed. People were watching them live at home on their televisions, and so many of them, were generally so immersed in it that when they were interviewed by people, they almost felt that they were there. And so their memories were skewed. And I suppose as a historian, this is why I felt that unlike journalists, I could make the decision to just be more careful when it comes to oral history. Because I'm a massive fan of oral history, and it's a big part of all my lessons here at the college. But equally, when it came to my own assessment of the period, I decided that instead I would focus on primary source material from the archives, from the various archives that I mentioned previously. I decided to focus on the British and Irish states. I disaggregated the agencies of the state. What that means is essentially I took each department and I compared them against each other, both the British government side and the Irish government. So I looked at the cabinet records, I compared what the Foreign Office was saying in comparison to the Home Office, I looked at the Prime Minister's office, what was the War Office saying. You find out these nuggets. I found out General Ian Freeman's papers were in the Imperial War Museum, and again I was comparing all of these documents against each other. And it was sensational. What I found immediately was, factional alliances within the government cabinets, within the government, the government agencies, I should say. Shifting public opinion, obviously the economic constraints as well, but really, I could see that there was mismanagement from both sides, really, from the very beginning. And a lot of the time, they were relying on decisions to be made from the bottom up, in terms of people who were experiencing it on the ground, not necessarily the heads of governments or the heads of those particular cabinets. So I'm going to give you two examples. I'll give you one side from the British side and one side from the Irish government side. Here's an example of the Home Office and the Ministry of Defence and competing agencies. In other words, both of them competing against each other and quietly within their own papers saying different things to what they were saying publicly, essentially. In June 1970, as the British Army were deployed on the streets of Northern Ireland, I think they were there about 9 months at this stage, the generals on the ground advised that the Ministry of Defence should take a fresh look at the situation. They felt that they needed to adapt. It was nothing like they'd ever witnessed before. General Freeland's own diary said, we're trying to keep peace among rival factions who quite frankly look alike, speak alike, and really we need some help here. They reached out to the Ministry of Defence. We need to set up some form of committee to try and make sure that we are dealing with this appropriately. So the Ministry of Defence reached out to the Home Office and they said, absolutely, and I quote, "We will help the Army in any way possible." This working group was established, and yet privately, as I was going through those documents, I could see that the Home Office were saying to each other, oh my God, the trouble of this working party, honestly, the trouble that it's giving us, and it's going to continue giving us. And that's just one example of the lack of unity amongst the different groups that really, again, showed the mismanagement that was happening then and the difficulties in the early stages of the conflict. And this wasn't just one side, as I mentioned earlier, because as the violence was intensifying on the streets, particularly in August 1969, to quote an old colleague of mine, Northern Ireland might well have been North Korea, so sparse was the reliable information that the government in Dublin really had. It may as well have been North Korea, not 100 miles up the road, so sparse, so delicate and so inaccurate that a lot of their information was. The tea shop, the Irish Prime Minister, Jack Lynch, for example, struggled to get his cabinet together in August 1969. He struggled to get them, obviously during recess, and one of them, Patrick Hillary, which I found a little nugget, my historians in the room know what I mean by nugget, found this little nugget in the papers that told me that actually Patrick Hillary, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, he was off on a painting holiday. But I know we're all artists, we're all entitled to painting holidays. But he was on a certain holiday where you actually couldn't be disturbed. So they couldn't get word to this guy that really you need to come home, we need to get the cabinet together because there is absolute anarchy almost on the streets, a mere 100 miles up the road. So I guess while he's there painting a lovely sun, a mere 20 miles from him, you might say, there's cars, there's houses, there's streets being burnt. And again, he couldn't be contacted. So this is just another example of the mismanagement. And when he was finally able to be contacted, he obviously got in touch with his counterpart in London, who said to him, no, you keep your nose out of our affairs. These are not your affairs, these are the affairs of Britain, not your affairs. So I guess when you're carrying out this sort of research, you really get a window into the mindset of how the civil servants and really the pressures that they were under, the pressures that they were under, working both day and night on this particular issue. For example, in August 1970, there was a particular civil servant who was watching the BBC and was praising the production of their new production of Shakespeare's Richard II. And he quoted to one of his friends, again I can see this in the papers, he said, as Richard II was stepping ashore, having wasted his best men and much money to subdue the barbarian Irish, Christ, times don't seem to have changed much in the last 600 years. And again, he's writing this in August 1970, and he said, I really don't know if a solution can be achieved in the next 18 months. Well, we, the adults in the room know that there was no solution even achieved in the next 18 years, let alone 18 months. Now, I'm conscious as well that, I want to tell the story, but I also don't want to go off too much into too much intricate detail. But if you are interested in this particular period as well, my historians advised me, because I was like, do I mention the article? Do I mention the article? So I have got an article on this particular, I don't get paid for it, and I'm not trying to get, but I have got some copies of it here. If you are interested to learning more, I can email you a copy of it. It'll give you more of an insight into the period 69 to 71. But I want to move forward now. I want to move really from 1970 onwards to really 1998. Because thankfully, this period, 1970, personalities do start to come through, on both sides. One example that I touch upon in the article, again, I don't get paid for it, one example that I touch upon was this guy, Sir Andrew Gilchrist, and his papers are in the Churchill Archive in Cambridge, and I know many of our students aspire to go to Cambridge, so you might be able to look at these papers. Now, Andrew really showed the importance of personality and the human touch, which I have no doubt the likes of Tony Blair and later leaders learnt from. He fought in the Second World War. He was a prisoner of war in a Japanese camp. And this passionate and personable Scotsman really became, he had been an ambassador in Bangkok, in Singapore, Chicago, bless him. He was sent to Ireland in 1966 as a retiring job. Little did poor Andrew know what he was getting himself into. Now, I mentioned Patrick Hillary, the artist, and he obviously came home and the Irish cabinet met up and they said, right, Patrick, we need you to go to the United Nations. Pack your bag, we're putting you on a plane, you're going to the United Nations. Because Britain were refusing formal negotiations with them at this stage, which we all know in hindsight, both states should have been communicating more, hence the success in later years. But they were refusing negotiations with them, and the Irish government tried to then, behind the British government's back, get the issue of, their papers in the north, or the 6 counties they have it in their papers, they wanted to raise it with the General Security Council. Now, Britain obviously got word of this because Britain is one of the leading powers really on the Security Council, so there was no chance they were going to be able to do this, to get Northern Ireland onto the United Nations agenda. And Andrew, when he found out of this debacle, he said, it is always refreshing to see a hawk turn into a dove, and that's kind of where I got that phrase from. But again, it's a reminder of the stark lack of diplomacy between both states at this period. Yet despite being rather amused by the incident, Andrew, to his credit, did start to work behind the scenes, as did a man from my own county, Frank Aiken, and they started to work behind the scenes to try and set up back channels. I'm going to take anything from this, it really is the importance of these back channels. And this is reaching out to the other side, trying to find some sense of commonality. And this, on the board, you can actually see a snippet. Now this is obviously a typewriter, we all know that they use typewriters then, but this is an extract of a meeting between Eamon de Valera, became President of the Republic of Ireland, Andrew Gilchrist, the British ambassador, and Frank Aiken. And it just gives you an example of the difficulties to find commonality, because here, as you'll see, all three of them disagree about where a horse race took place, where a race took place. So to give you an example, I won't stray too long on it, but de Valera said to Andrew Gilchrist, "You have a fine residence here, Ambassador." Gilchrist said, "Yeah, thank you. One of the most distinguished things about my residence is that there's a grave of a famous horse here as well." And de Valera said, "Yes, I know. It was the English Derby it ran in." And Andrew Gilchrist goes, no, 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 it was the Kentucky Derby. Aiken said, no, 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 it was the Irish Derby. And again, they're starting to, tender hooks. What does Devil Earl do? He decides to throw in a little hook. Yeah, well, that's not the only horse that's buried here. He says, apparently, Strongbow's horse is buried here as well. Now, for those people who don't know 12th century British and Irish history, Strongbow was the first Norman to set his foot in Ireland. So again, it's showing the tender hooks and the difficulties that they were having to find some common ground. They were falling out over a horse. I kid you not. But across the border, another man was risking his life and reaching out to all sides in the peace process. And would you believe I'm actually going to return to talking about fish and chips? Guess what I'm having this evening? But because it was the work of this back channel here, Brendan Duddy, who, as the owner of a fish and chips shop in the 1960s, he met a young Martin McGuinness, who was obviously a leading member of the IRA. He was a key figure later on with Sinn Féin as well. And he at the time was a van driver delivering beef burgers to Dudley's Butchers. To Dudley's fish and chip shop on behalf of McGuinness was the lorry driver, basically, the van driver for a butcher. But Dudley's reach went across the community divide. You know, one of his best friends, Frank Lagan, was also Derry's chief of police. So he was a man who policemen went and bought their fish and chips. And, you know, look, some people in the room know that's quite a staggering thing to be able to happen, but it did. But following the outbreak of the conflict, Brendan Dudley was absolutely an avowed pacifist. He hated any form of violence. He worked closely with the IRA leadership, with the British authorities, to try and end the armed campaign. These triangular talks, which took place literally in his living room. He had two living rooms. He had a bigger living room and he had a small living room. And he deliberately had them in the small living room to try and keep them all together and to try and find commonality and some form of warmth between these vital people. In the picture here, you can see Brendan Dudley alongside British MI6 agent Michael Oakley, who reached out to Dudley. He started to hear about Dudley, and he reached out to him. And as I said, this triangular talks between Dudley, Oakley, and McGuinness started to take place on that very couch that you can see in the slide. Now, Brendan Dudley once described himself as an elastic band, stretching as far as possible, trying to connect one side to the other, desperately hoping that he wouldn't snap. And the connections that Brendan Dudley, he made stretched across the terms of many of the prime ministers, for example, Thatcher, Major, and Blair. And crucially, Brendan Dudley was able to gain the trust of people from all sides of the community, as well as obviously the British and Irish governments. But it wasn't easy. Again, many of the people in the room will know this. On several occasions, the lines of communication broke down. The Sunningdale Agreement in 1973, the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, the Downing Street Declaration in 1993, all of these broke down. And in the meantime, in 1993, the secret channel of communication became public knowledge, and all of a sudden there was threats to Brendan's life. And really, I suppose the only fortunate thing at this stage I could say is that it was starting to become clear to the British and Irish government, really, that these back channels that Brendan Duddy and Gilchrist and stuff beforehand were channeling, were promoting, really in many ways needed to become part of the policy of the policymakers themselves. Maybe a route that they had to start to consider following. But it was clear that Dudley's approach around the fire was needed, but only if everyone was included. Everyone. And that meant all shades of green, all shades of orange being invited to the negotiating table. And that was one crucial factor that they started to realise. Behind me here, you can see how the official policymakers began to learn the human approach and the importance of personalities. Looking down here for a minute, sidestep, Mr. Kemsley tells us the importance of communication skills and personalities that all of our students have in abundance. And I couldn't help but say that when I'm talking about these massive personalities on the slides. And hopefully some of you guys will follow suit in future years. And really, please do actually get involved in politics. But undoubtedly, the build-up of trust between the agencies of the British and Irish states really was pivotal, and it wasn't possible without these back channelers really. Thankfully, by the time of, certainly near the end of Major's time, the rivalry of the 1960s and 70s was gone. Bertie Ahern of the Irish government, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton from America, these are all massive personalities. The amazing Mo Mowlam, wow, she replaced handshakes with hugs. That woman. She hugged everyone, hugged every party. She visited both sets of prisoners in prison. She, as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, she was fighting cancer at the same time. And she very famously used to take off her wig when she was having meetings and there might have been a bump in the peace process. She would throw her wig at them and go, really, seriously, come on, catch yourself on. Don't know if she said that, but, I'm just thinking, Mo was just an incredible figure who really reached out to the key people from the two communities. And, reaching the concluding stages here, when I was writing this lecture for this evening, I actually felt really proud that I have a new claim to fame. I know we started at the start talking about, and he is still late, great, Terry Wogan, but I have to say that I'm very proud that in 2012 I got the opportunity to meet Brendan Duddy. I met him at the opening of his archive really in the University of Galway at a conference, and sadly Brendan at this stage had suffered a stroke 2 years prior. I mean, in a terrible twist of fate, a man who was burdened with everybody else's secrets for decades, trying to keep them from his own family. The fact that he actually lost his voice due to the stroke was really, really, really sad. And as I said, I never ever included interviews in my own work, but he was the only person out of, I suppose, in all my process of my studies that I went up to and I spoke to, because he was totally still there mentally, and he was there with his children, and they thanked me, because people think, oh, he's had a stroke, he can't talk, I'm not going to go near this person, but I'm so glad I'm not. But I just wanted to say, Mr. Dudley, thank you so much for allowing me to go to university and my parents being able to sleep at night. So I was very moved about it, and I particularly was very moved. You can see that Brendan Dudley passed away in 2017. People from all sides, both green and orange, spoke about this wonderful man. Arlene Foster, former First Minister, leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, spoke about how he helped to create a shared Northern Ireland. Gerry Adams, he was a decent man. The Irish government's former Minister of Foreign Affairs again said he was a quiet hero of peace. And would you believe, actually, in certain countries in the world now, the name Brendan is used by governments as a code when they're attempting to gain peace through back channels. They actually use the term Brendan. So, to conclude, I would argue, not just because I'm from there, but I think that the Northern Ireland peace process really is a stellar model of conflict resolution. I hope that this evening I've helped to unlock a small part of the story really for you, and show you the importance of back channels in helping to gain trust amongst all the players. It wasn't easy, to quote the Beatles, it was a long and winding road. But I would argue that many countries at the moment could perhaps are lacking the likes of Aiken, Gilchrist and Brendan Duddy, who got the hawks and doves amongst the British and Irish policymakers to trust each other, and most importantly to steer Northern Ireland from conflict and towards harmony and peace. Thank you very much.